Cool. Okay. Hi, everyone. Super welcome to another open hangout with the Brand the Change community. Welcome, Alison. So nice to have you here.
Thank you.
We usually have quite an intimate group of people, so about 20-30 people joining us. And as you can tell, we're all on the calls. This is not a webinar format, and that's just because we really want to be able to have a lovely conversation together. We're going to just briefly take you through the rules of the room for today, give you a short intro, and then get to the conversation with Alison as quick as possible. Let's see. Wanjiru, if you're there, feel free to come in. Otherwise, I'll run everyone through it. Cool. So feel free to chat away. So use the Zoom chat anytime. Introduce yourself, share your LinkedIn profile. You can interrupt. However, for today, what we've done is we've actually organized, you've pre-submitted all your questions to Alison. I'll have the pleasure of putting those in front of everyone. So we'll open the mic a little bit later. So feel free to share a question in chat as well if you like, and I can pick it up along the way. We always ask everyone to be kind, to share your gifts. So if there's anything here that you do want to contribute also to the conversation, like we're really eager and open to hear your perspective as well. Then there's the law of 2 feet. If you're not at all enjoying the session, or if you're not learning anything, please feel free to just use your 2 feet and leave the room. No, English is not a problem. Most of us here are not native English speakers. We love it when you can turn on your video so we can see your faces. I know that this is recorded, so it is entirely possible that if you ask a question or somehow you come into view, that is part of the recording that is shared publicly. And we just always do a disclaimer that we don't have any sort of financial deal with whoever comes in here. So they're doing this out of their generosity, and we're not receiving anything in return ourselves. Cool. So for those of you who are new, you might not know what Brand the Change is. So Brand the Change is a call to action to better sell the great products and ideas for change that we see emerging in the world. And it started as a workshop format, grew into a book, grew into a community, and that's how we all find ourselves here today. We have other events happening in the open community this month, like a think tank on audience research with George Beverly. That's on the 18th of November, so it's next month. So if you're ever considering doing customer research, he's a really great guy to learn more from about audience research. We have a personal branding mastermind group and a facilitator think tank. The goals of these sessions, these open hangouts, are really threefold. So the first thing is that we really all just want to learn as much as we can from people like Alison and from each other. We hope that you leave with great ideas for your own brand and meet potential collaborators. Yeah, I'm super thrilled, Alison, to have you with us today. So Alison is the kind of the brand brain behind brands like Esty and Eventbrite and Miro and Blue Apron. And as someone who has spent kind of the majority of my career on the agency side, I've always wanted to kind of be a fly on the wall in the office of a brand exec. So this is the next best thing that I can imagine, Alison. Cool. Great. So let's kick off. We have, Alison, we have about, I think, 10 pretty strong questions from the group. And it was really interesting to see the kind of patterns emerge. What were people submitting as questions? What were people voting up? And I'm going to get to those questions, but I first wanted to actually kind of indulge in my own curiosity. I've always noticed that really good brand people often have a writing background, and I saw that you actually studied English at the University of Iowa.
That is correct. Yeah, my background is in writing. I feel like I've been a writer for most of my life, but I feel like a lot of strategy, it does come from your words and your ideas. And I feel like the line between brand and creative as well, it's obviously so close. And but yeah, my background is in writing, and I feel like I still use it, I mean, basically every day, but I feel like just towards slightly different purposes. My degree was in English with a focus on both like fiction, writing more generally, communications, but also I had like a focus area around nonfiction, which was something that I originally had started out as a journalism major and switched.
Yeah. Wow. And then, so you're studying English. Did you have any idea that you would want to kind of apply that in the brand space at any point?
No. So I feel like I kind of fell into the world of marketing. So I definitely have always been a person who love culture, love media. I mean, I wanted to be, I moved to New York right after college, but very much at that point, magazines were already kind of dying. But my aspiration was always like more traditional editorial, but like telling stories in different ways. And I feel like being able to explore different sorts of fields and tap into different types of I basically fell into a role at Etsy very early on. I was like employee number 10 there, where at the time like job descriptions were barely even a thing, but it was really more around doing story driven outreach and communications for a brand. And I don't even think at the time that I would have called it marketing or thought it was as such, but just using those skills, I think, to just tell stories to different audiences for different purposes. And I feel like that's been a really interesting tangent to explore. And I think also just when you think about the nature of social media, advertising in general, just like how brands grow, it's all, I think, taking a lot of those sorts of skills and applying them in different ways.
Yeah, I can imagine. I don't know if this is the case around the world, but there's always a big point being made about liberal arts kind of education not leading to very profitable careers, but it seems to have worked out for a lot of people with a writing background in the brand space. So it'd be just really interesting to learn, like, so you became an editorial manager at Etsy, and you were there for like taking it from like a little indie marketplace to like this global brand. This is just, I mean, that must have been, first of all, opportunity of a lifetime, but also just a huge learning curve. Can you describe what your time there looked like?
Yes. So I definitely did not feel like staying 10 years anywhere at this point in time is quite unusual. But also seeing that evolution, I think, was definitely a really interesting experience and one that was quite invaluable for me. But when I say I was employee number 10, like it was very much like who's taking out the garbage today to the dumpster to the curb. Like it was very much all hands on deck at the beginning and not being very precious about, I think everyone had their focus area where they wanted to explore, but at the same time being like, this is something where when it's this early stage, you're kind of doing everything. And over the course of my time there, being able to really sort of like hone out this focus area that was primarily focused on like storytelling. And so everything from, starting a lot of the original like social and, blog editorial channels to then thinking more about like, okay, how does this company, what is its overall, like, what do we stand for? What is this brand story and how do we become relevant or stay relevant in a lot of these different countries and to different audiences that we care about? And I think also that allowed me, I think, especially with the company's also sort of natural evolution and growth into new markets, which was like mostly Canada, UK, Australia, France, Germany, but other broader parts of Europe as well. Being able to think about like, how do you take those same sort of narrative skills and think about like the strategic approach for different audiences, different ways to activate that. So like, how are we thinking about, partnerships and creative, but even like, what is the tone of voice? How does this brand come to life? To then being, my last role there was director of brand and content. So that was everything from working on like a revised brand strategy and actually thinking about like, how do you take this brand that people love and help it grow, but at the same time, maintain what made it special and unique when it was much smaller, like that special essence, to like broader advertising programs, activations, all the way like through full funnel. So it was definitely a really interesting experience. And there was a lot of like ability to just move within the organization as well to focus on like different projects and areas. And definitely feel very thankful to have had that experience.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's amazing. And that's actually interesting that you mentioned that there's some, there was strategy involved in thinking like, how do we stay true to the brand? Because I think that's something that was definitely a question that came up. how does a brand like Etsy, how does it stay true to its vision? And like, how can you ensure from your position as the head of brand that, even though there might be business opportunities, like, how do you stay true? How can you help that process from your role?
Yeah. So, I mean, like the story of Etsy in general, is an interesting one in terms of the early days origins, because I would say that it actually started out like pretty anti-capitalism and kind of punk, in a way that like was not actually about selling things at all. I feel like the original founding team was actually more about, not necessarily just seeing like, here's a business opportunity, let's create a startup around this, more so to the idea of, why is there no place that I can actually find something that is handmade or handcrafted? Like, why doesn't this exist? And it was also just in reaction, I think, to like mass production in general. We actually used to have like giant flags around the office of like end mass production, different things like that. And I feel like, how do you actually take that and evolve it into a company today that is a publicly traded company? In some ways, I think you could say certain elements of it are definitely like, if you could have imagined that at that early stage, it would have been like maybe laughable. But I think the elements that always made it very unique were definitely like right place, right time culturally. Had the benefit of being able to start at a time when people were actually like appreciating and wanting these types of like goods, but also just wanting to focus on like independent makers and creatives. But yeah, I think as the company continued to grow, there was a need to be very purposeful about a lot of the decisions. And I will say that there were quite a few, from the inside, I would say missteps, like things that did happen that were, yeah, I mean, I think also people recognized at the time, like when we were starting to stray a little too far from that original vision. So there were certain moments around like, new business launches, like in order to scale, change some of the policies to actually be more broadly focused around things that were not traditionally handcrafted. And there was this idea that handcraft doesn't scale. So if we want to grow as a business, clearly we need to have, how can we sort of bend the rules about what manufacturing means? And so if you can make 100 of something or 500 of something, is it truly handmade anymore? And I feel like, thankfully, there was a very inclusive environment where like you didn't necessarily need to be at like the executive leadership level to be able to raise your hand and say like, why are we making some of these decisions? How can we, stay true to what makes Etsy special? And I think, yeah, there were a few different years where, it was not all roses. Like it was challenging at times, I think, to see it going in directions that didn't necessarily feel right. Thankfully, toward the end of my tenure there, we were able to actually, we did some really valuable brand work and in partnership with a few different agencies, but also I think like a cross section of people internally as well, to really kind of get to that like core idea of Etsy, which the final product of which was this idea of entry points, and actually thinking about like, what are the category entry points for a brand like Etsy? Because you don't wake up in the morning and say, I want to buy a handmade pair of socks. Nobody thinks like that. That's not something that you need or anyone really seeks out. We realized, and it was kind of a light bulb moment, that a lot of what makes Etsy different was actually this idea of, when you look at the core competitors, in the press, people were always comparing Etsy to Amazon, and the two could not be further apart in my mind. But we realized that where Etsy could actually win was this idea of wanting something special, not necessarily handcrafted, but something that is actually, I mean, it seems very clear to say it now, but I think at the time, people who were so close to the business just couldn't actually see that it was around this idea of like special or unique, which is inclusive of things like Etsy also has vintage, stuff like that. But that when you wake up and say like, well, I could just get, buy something for my friend as a gift at like, maybe you would buy it at a local boutique, maybe you would just like buy it at a big box store. But if you want something special, wanting to be identified as, this is the place where I would actually go to find that. And I think that really kind of unlocked a lot of opportunities around how to help the business to make smart decisions in terms of being able to scale in its approach, but also something that felt ownable across many different markets, that transcended. It's not just like an American thought or idea, but something that could actually have legs. And it was, I think, a real really valuable endpoint to a project to actually then be able to help everyone internally to also rally around this idea.
So then what's interesting, I think, about what you're saying also, or what I hear you say, is like, if you're the head of brand, so I'm assuming that your domain is kind of considered, this is the person who does the outgoing communication stuff. You're not in charge of the product or the business decisions necessarily, but you are in charge of like guarding that, like the authenticity of it. That must be hard. Like, you either need to have like tremendous capacity to make friends with those people, or to use the right arguments to get everyone aligned. How were you able, did you need to convince your colleagues, like, hey, if this like gets too loose and we lose this unique edge through how we set the standard for how people come in, we're going to lose the competitive edge as a brand? How did you get people on board with that?
I will say that I definitely had the benefit of, I think, having an executive team that is aligned with the idea of brand is something that can really make or break your success as a leader. Anyone who is like being protective of the brand overall. I think if you have a leadership team in place, especially a CEO or CMO who is not really sold on the idea of like why brand is an asset or a differentiator or something that can actually help your business to prosper in the long term, it's going to be a really hard uphill battle to be able to persuade and actually help people to understand why this is actually something that's worth investing in. So I will say, had the benefit of a leadership team that was aligned, but a lot of it is also, I mean, showing the benefit of why brand is actually an important asset that can help to move a brand from being like transactional to something that can be more beloved with longer metrics that you would care about. So not just like net promoter score, but also customer lifetime value. Not only like getting customers, but keeping them, because there is more of an emotional connection. And in this way, I think everybody realized that Etsy as a brand was something special. But I think like before we did some of this like core brand work, what anybody would have told you, I feel like it would have been, 100 different answers, which is typically the case, where it's just like, well, I think it's this, I think it's that, and everyone has the right intention. And being able to crystallize it in this way, and then also socialize it to make sure that people felt that it was also something that was applicable to their work, and not necessarily like, oh, you're just giving me a toolkit I'm never going to use, or this is just a bunch of colors and fonts, not necessarily something that actually affects my work. And really showing people that like, this is something that can galvanize their approach and how it can actually help them to be more thoughtful and purposeful with what they're doing. And so I feel like not only this revised strategy, but also like new mission, new vision, like really sort of setting the company up for longer term success with like a new like centralized approach. I think we also like had a previous brand strategy that was not adopted, like completely failed. Yeah. And that one, I think also sometimes it just doesn't stick, or it's just not quite there. And it was one that I think was probably maybe a little too conceptual, a little too abstract. And I think sometimes if you actually look at like, sometimes it's right in front of you and you're just not looking at it or not seeing it. And it takes a certain outside perspective to actually reorient you. But in that case, like the one that we had maybe 2 or 3 years prior was a complete failure. Like it did not stick at all, was not used by anyone. It's basically like it never happened. So I definitely learned a lot through that process as well, in terms of like, wanting to make sure that you're very clear about like, why are we doing this? What does success look like? And if you don't have like a clear plan, also not only of how to roll it out, but also like to create something with the right stakeholders in the room, because you can't also just be saying like, this is only something that like the executive team or people who work in marketing or brand should be aligned with. Like it really should be a much more cross-functional group. Otherwise, like it is destined to fail.
Yeah. I was curious about that, because I think for a lot of people in the brand space, like one of the most frustrating things is that, like a year of work goes into like a brand manual or a book, and then it's put in a drawer. So just like very practically, how do you get people to kind of live the brand? Like you don't just show up one day and you say, hey guys, this is strategy, this is going to how it work, and please apply. Like what would this kind of the integration, or what would that look like in practice?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it comes down to, yeah, being very inclusive of like, who are the people who are in the room who are actually sharing like their common questions around like, what's not working for me today? What are the questions that I have about like, you know, well, can people clearly describe what the company or brand is in like a one sentence way? Most of the time they can't. Can I provide a toolkit that's not just, yeah, colors and fonts, but actual like core messaging or ideas that help people to understand where we're headed, but also how we are different, so that someone from sales or customer experience or even like HR knows how to apply this to their work and how to actually use it in a way that helps them to, make hires, make sales, clearly describe to their parents, like, I work at this company, it's a brand called X, and we do this, this is what we're focused on. I think, yeah, definitely need to think with like, who are the people who will actually be using this? And similar to like any brand or marketing exercise, like not only the external audience out in the world, but like the people who live and breathe the brand every day, who are actually supporting the brand, like they are one of the major stakeholders and core audience too. And if you're not thinking with their ideas and questions in mind, you're not doing user research with them, you're missing out on like a huge opportunity to actually make this stick.
Mm. So if you're thinking about, let's say today, you are starting a new role. You are starting a new role, but I'm assuming they have already a team in place. But what would you say today would be like kind of the ideal team that you would build in order to kind of create that really strong strategy and make sure that it sticks and make sure that it shines through in all the actions and the communications?
Yeah. So I mean, I'm also like familiar with the idea of often like being scrappy or being that person, especially in consulting roles in the last few years, being that like first, second, third brand hire when people don't necessarily understand the value of, well, number one, why would I care about this? What is brand? Why should we invest in it? I know these are questions that come up quite often. When I think about the structure of the team, I think the most important things to start from, I mean, definitely, obviously, just like strategy, like broadly more cultural speaking as well, just like to really understand not only like who you are as a brand, but to poke holes and to really understand like where are the moments where we can be relevant. Someone who can really start to be that like strategic owner and really like being also creating some guardrails and really starting to like create some structure around like, what is this? Let's make it less fuzzy. I think research is also just a huge element. So understanding your customer, but also your place in the world and really being able to answer a lot of those core questions. And even like measurement is something that comes up quite often too. So not just the research, but also like, how do we actually measure a lot of these things around consideration, awareness? Oftentimes, as someone who has been in-house, having an agency partner is often something that can be really valuable too. Like, don't try to think that you have to do it all yourself. Building an in-house team, depending on the setup, can obviously have its benefits, but I think that like working with an external agency can also be really advantageous to get a kickstart and actually get going. Yeah, I feel like if you're building a team from scratch, obviously the creative team is part of this too. So I mean, like how you're bringing it to life through, so like through design and copy. But I generally think that like brand and creative should be so close in terms of how they're actually building trust and being able to like brief one another in a way that is not just, I need to send 10 emails, why don't you just design them for me? I think like moving to something that is more insight driven, and really sort of understanding like what is the actual problem to solve. So I think having that very close as well is essential. And I mean, I think if you're starting from the very beginning, those are the first pieces that I think are so key. But I think ongoing, the brand structures, I've worked with so many, oftentimes having, larger brand marketing teams that are inclusive of things like owned, earned, and paid. So sometimes like with a lens on it's advertising, PR, events, partnerships, social content. So I've worked within that sort of structure, as well as one that is more like, creative and strategy sitting together. I think that there is no one size fits all.
And just to kind of understand, if you're thinking about your role and the kind of team that you have, what would your or your team's calendar look like for the year, for the month, for the week?
In terms of meetings or what we're focused
In
on?
terms of activities. So do you, well, let's say, do you have a strategy for the year? Like, this is what we want to achieve as the brand team, and these are either metrics we want to hit or goals we want to achieve.
Yeah,
And this is what we're going
definitely
to do to
looking
get
at the
there.
year ahead. And so we're doing that right now. So I just joined in a new role, and I'm working with a company that is very much focused on social first marketing with the Gen Z audience. And so I think being very clear about like the macro and the micro. So those big moments, like the sort of like blowout like campaigns, perhaps like on a quarterly basis, as well as those day-to-day moments where like the brand shows up. I think the other thing too is to actually think holistically about the brand experience. It's not just the campaigns, it's the always on. And that also is something, like, to make sure I'm calling it out, is customer experience. So not just the core product, but even like customer service, especially, if you're a consumer brand, but even B2B as well, like how are you actually showing up for people and making sure that like in those always on channels, not just the ones that are on the calendar, that you have consistency in that experience. But I would say generally speaking, yeah, I think like even creating a narrative for the year about like how are we starting versus how are we ending? What are the ways that we can show up and be relevant? So for the company that I'm working for currently, one of the things that we're trying to balance is like global and local marketing. So specifically things that are more across Europe versus like in each country. And then being able to see, are there like synchronicities across different things that culturally are relevant in all these countries? And so for us, one of those big things will probably be considering COVID, considering general attitudes. Like next summer is going to be the summer of festivals, we anticipate. And so then really thinking about like, how do we bring that to life, not only through, events and partnerships and ongoing content, but also like, are we doing broader activations? Are we doing TV and out of home in different markets? That sort of thing.
Hmm. I find this, the comment that you made about the customer experience, would you say that falls under your direct domain, or is that something that you now need to talk to the customer experience people to? Like, is it a separate department in the same way that marketing and sales are often divided? And then how can you actually get people to come along if they're a different department, let's say, with a separate budget?
Yeah, great question. I actually have worked in one brand where at one company where customer experience was under the brand team, which I thought was really savvy, specifically because really wanting to make sure that there was an incredibly tight relationship there. I think it's not the usual, but I think there is an evolving school of thought that, especially because like all of those day-to-day interactions that are happening, especially when people are already having a problem, can really make or break your relationship with a company. And when you think about like that long-term relationship, like, I couldn't get them on the phone. They wouldn't answer this. They wouldn't take it back. I feel like that is what will really, make or break your relationship with a brand. And it's not often taken into consideration. And so I don't think it always has to be under the brand team, but I feel like especially if there are really big problems to solve, that sometimes it can make sense to put them together or to create like a cross-functional squad almost, where it's like, how can we actually try to bring these two closer together? But I think that's also where, like, if you're in a brand role, you have to be so incredibly cross-functional, like you mentioned, like really thinking about how to make people feel like the brand strategy is a tool that they can use, as opposed to something that's been like put upon them or something to put in a drawer, so that they can actually apply it when they're making decisions, not only in places like the product and how they make, business decisions about how to move forward, but even like having a core set of values or principles to be able to come to when like, okay, I have a really, difficult customer complaint. Like how do we think about responding to this? Or even like internally, this is why I mentioned the cross-functional stakeholders when you're establishing these brand strategy principles. Two people are in an argument and need to make a decision or have a fundamental disagreement, I think having something that people can go to as a resource about like how you treat one another, what is punished, who is promoted or elevated, and how does that relate to your values versus like who is who is let go. I feel like those are the things also that people really take away from them when they take away with them when they think about what a company's really like.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of our conversations within the community always revolve around like, how do you actually walk the talk? And I think that's the biggest like breakout off point for a lot of relationships people have with their brand when they experience that disconnection between what's being said and how it's acted upon, whether you're on the inside of a team and you see misbehavior not being punished, or you're on the outside. I thought something that you said a little while ago that I wanted to get back to is you mentioned like, yeah, you're going to have a really tough uphill battle if you have a leadership that doesn't really believe in brand. Should we just abandon ship and decide like, well, if these people aren't willing to see what I see, then this is not the place for me to have a role? Or would you say like, no, you know, I'm going to be the, or you should be the evangelist, you should be fighting for these arguments. And, you know, because at the end of the day, you're going to hopefully change that, kind of change that attitude.
Yeah. So I think you have to be that evangelist, but I think it's also just from a personal point of view, like know when to hold them, you know when to, I think, walk away if it's not necessarily like, if you've been doing this for multiple years with no success, then maybe it's time for a change. But generally speaking, I think that there are that brand is something that people do care about. And I think approach from very different, sometimes a different tack can really make the difference in terms of getting more buy-in. And I think that there are like different like brand researchers, theorists, like different schools of thought that can sometimes also, for someone who's coming at it from a very tactical objective, they're not really thinking about like, some people don't. I personally do buy into the concept of having like a brand that can be like loved or aspired to, versus like, I think there are other schools of thought that are more around like, it's all just about a memory exercise. It's just about like seeing that logo and remembering that I saw it somewhere and then I'm going to buy that thing.
Mm.
And so I do think the power of persuasion and being that brand evangelist is really important. And I think that there are also ways to show not only, I mean, there are a lot of different studies that you can actually pull out of your pocket if need be, which I have, around just like longer term business value that comes from investment in brand. And it can be everything from like those different things around like repetition and memory, but at the same time also like, you know, look at Facebook as an example. It's also a huge element of reputation, especially if you're in a category, you know, that has not historically invested in brand and has been something that has just been perhaps more, a functional utility that people took for granted, and they didn't necessarily think about, you know, this larger structure and like what it stood for. And when you get into these sort of like ethical quandaries or companies that are being put under the spotlight, I think having that like positive brand value behind you of just like your reputation and what you've already done and said for many years can really be a huge asset. And if you haven't invested in that, you know, I think it's also like when the next shiny brand comes along and they're like, you know, competing with you, let's say on like price or convenience or any other thing, like those things can very easily make or break your business. And if you have nothing for people to hold on to, and it's like, well, that's cheaper, race to the bottom, Amazon effect, then it's really difficult to maintain something longer term in terms of like your actual business. And brand can be this really competitive element.
Yeah. So if for you, if it's about the love and the heart, let's say, and you're working with a team that's very kind of data driven and just wants to see kind of hard numbers, do you have like what's on the Fitbit dashboard for brand love? Like what would be that you would, or the numbers that you would kind of try and maybe quantify some of that love with?
Yeah, I mean, there are the obvious ones around like awareness and consideration or likelihood to try, but I think like net promoter score and overall like reputation and would you recommend are definitely things that, you know, those are hard won, and those are things that you also need to really foster. But I think also these like ongoing conversations and customer lifetime value is also a huge one. It's not just like, did you make that? I'm coming obviously from like kind of a consumer point of view here, but like it's not just about like that one purchase. It's about like a much longer term relationship with someone where you can have a potential relationship for, you know, years or more, and actually have be something that they look to as a resource. But also, like, I think about brands that have done a really great job of this, like Glossier is an example, like the US beauty brand, um, where people are, you know, ambassadors and evangelists for free. They love to talk about it. It's huge on social. And I feel like if you can have like a message that really resonates with a particular audience and feels like authentic and relevant, you can also create this sort of, you know, like influence effect where people just want to talk about what you're doing, and you're not having to like pay to get in front of them. And that to me is like some of the ultimate brand love. I think also like Lego, like there are some great examples where people just like want, you know, you say the name, people are like, I love Lego. I love, you know, the word just comes out of their mouth. And I feel like there are some really interesting case studies and playbooks to be looked at of like, when you have this type of like bring this type of emotional reaction from people, it takes a lot more, I think, to lose their trust, or to have them not be this sort of paragon.
So I mean, some people obviously have like an unreasonable amount of love for a particular brand, even like sometimes years after they stop interacting, they haven't actually kept up. That is like something like Lego or Glossier or Etsy. For people who are starting today, that feels like that's like that kind of love is miles off. But at the same time, you see that big brands really sometimes, I think, you know, you're almost jealous of companies that are starting small and scrappy because they're able to get a lot more love in a way, because they are the kind of David versus the Goliath. If you were invited to join a small group of founders, like you were again the 10th hire today, what would you invest in? Let's say they gave you, you know, a small budget and said, okay, Alison, help us build that love. What would you invest it in?
I would say, I mean, definitely I would be coming at it from a brand point of view. The other thing that we'll have to talk about as well is just like brand is a long-term investment. It is not, I think people have become very addicted to short-term results. And that's something that they can see and understand, which is part of the reason that like brand is much more like the sort of stepchild. If I had that sort of budget today, I think the first thing that I would think about is creator and influencer marketing, because I feel like so much of how people understand or engage with a brand comes through recommendations from people that they know and trust. And whether that's through like an unpaid recommendation or one that comes through an ad or a creator, I feel like if you want to gain like real relevance, that is one of the primary channels today, as opposed to like, I think the nature of attention has also just diverged. Like people aren't watching linear TV in the same way. Like everyone's on a personal, like their own TikTok, their own Netflix, that they're coming at this from a different way. So finding relevance through the people that they identify and trust, or the publications that they identify with and trust, is definitely, I think, of like the new nature of media. And that just is something that I think also just community building overall. If you have a product that people can bring people together around like a niche or an interest, is also something to me that's really something to grab onto. And really then, because people, I think, for as much as the internet has, you know, pulled people in all directions as well, are looking for that sort of tangible community around like an interest, a subculture. And they're also looking for like recommendations, not only for products, but also just like how to live. And so that's where I think for me, brand building through social marketing and influencer is like some of the most interesting and culturally relevant stuff that's happening today. Like I look at TikTok in general, and I just feel like the future of marketing is definitely there and is already happening. And but it's also, yeah, it's happening in real time.
Yeah, I mean, when you're thinking about the speed at which kind of the brand world changes and the marketing world changes, how do you keep up? How do you keep fresh? Because I mean, I remember, I think last year I saw you share a post about like a merchandise drop. which I thought like, oh, this is for me. It was like totally like, oh yeah, this is obviously a thing right now, but there's so many things and there's trends that come and go. So how do you stay up to date, and how you do decide like which one is relevant? Because like before you know it, you're like a bit of peanut butter that's spread across 12 different sandwiches, and no sandwich tastes good because you're trying to do TikTok and trying to this, that. So
Yeah, I think you have to be purposeful. I know for me, like I am a voracious media consumer. Like I definitely subscribe. I love to think about culture, read about culture, experience it on social as well. But like Substack is just such a treasure trove. And I think especially if you can find and curate for yourself, like this sort of list of trusted resources to really be able to, there are a few that I really love so much that I recommend to everyone, I feel like, but like a few in particular that I get every single week that I feel like is this digested version of like the best from Twitter and TikTok and just like culture in general. I think especially Gen Z culture, like TikTok drops the metaverse as it continues to evolve. So I love reading and thinking about that just because like I think the nature of being a strategist is wanting to understand why people are the way they are, human behavior, why and how they consume, but also just thinking about the future. And so that's something that I definitely, I feel like that's what makes me tick, and also the stuff that I am the most interested in, like brands that feel that they are positively contributing to culture in some way or shaping it. I One last other thought too before we open it to questions. I do think that brand building in general is in a really interesting place, and being a brand person is an interesting place because there is this cookieless future that is coming, and those short-term investments in performance marketing that immediately gave you these results, like that world is going to disappear and shift dramatically in the next few years. And when you think about just the nature of like brand building, advertising, marketing, if you think back to like the 50s or the 60s and more traditional channels, you know, linear TV, out of home, et cetera, like, yes, we've had the benefit of being able to target people in this very micro level, but privacy and just moving back in this direction, I think that we're going to be in a completely new world. Some things always stay the same in terms of just like, who are the celebrities or people of influence that you look to and that you want to emulate, or that you listen to them for advice or want to aspire to be like them. But at the same time, I think that an investment in like building brands that last, long-term versus short-term investment, because also when you think about those brands that are doing well and they're so beloved, they've had years of investment as well. These are not things that just launched yesterday. Like even if these larger brands like Lego or Coke or any of these ones, that they've been investing in brand for years and years and years. I think that there's going to be a really interesting sea change to come, and that people who have made their business on these short-term, easily quantifiable investments are going to have to come up with a completely different strategy.
Yeah, I remember a conversation that we had with the Growth Tribe in Amsterdam, the growth hacking, growth marketing academy. And they said that they always hate the brand people because the brand people are pulling them back all the time while they're just looking for what's, you know, what's actually working and getting lots of people on board. And the brand people said like, yeah, but those are not necessarily our people, or you're hurting the brand because it's not the experience that we want to have. So imagine what it sounds like is that the growth marketing people might have to lower the volume on their on their statements.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it also like it takes all kinds, and I think that that balance between brand and performance, it's always a percentage of each. And I think for different companies, like there are different approaches. Some are more story driven, especially if you're a category that like is new and people have never heard it, experienced it, understood it before, which to me is, I think, what I tend to be attracted to, like the ones that need a little more contextualizing versus just like the utility of like, we sell socks. And so I think, yeah, I think the two work together and you need both to really thrive. But I think I definitely sit more in one camp.
What are the brands that you feel are doing an amazing job right now? What are the brands that you follow and that you think all of us should follow or take a look at? Or
Oatly. I think Oatly is just doing really outstanding things, which if you look at their structure as well, like they don't have a traditional marketing team. I think that their like overall internal structure actually melds like the creative team and channel owners all kind of sit together, which I think is actually really interesting because there isn't so much structure put between. But I think that like they obviously like talk about also like they've been around for probably 10 or 15 years, but like culturally really became so much more relevant, right place, right time in the last like 5 years. And I feel like also the work that they're doing is very fearless. Like they're definitely not afraid also to really pursue this idea of being an outsider in the space, future facing, taking a very like pointed point of view, which I think is great. So many brands are not. And it's really not being willing to like take a point of view and a stance. I really admire that for them. I'm trying to think other brands that I mean, I go to Oatly all the time also just because I think their tone of voice is so completely different and unexpected, and I really enjoy that. I already mentioned Glossier, but I feel like they've also just done a great job with this idea of like the company was built off the back of starting with like a blog publication and actually being so attuned to like requests and comments that were actually coming in on their content of like, why can't I find something like this? My perfect idea of concealer would look or feel like this, and being very customer focused and just like actually listening to the people in their community and creating products for them. So I feel like that was also just like such an amazing case study. Those are the two that I think really come to mind. I mean, Netflix is everywhere. I think Netflix is also just so ubiquitous at this point that it's hard to believe that there was a time when it was just sending DVDs back and forth in the mail, which I do remember that point. But I feel like they've also done a lot of interesting things just in terms of like creating things that are very culturally relevant and like becoming this major production studio, but also like, I think it's a really interesting challenge when you are a platform, when it's like not necessarily that you're creating your products yourself, it's more that you are the curator and the host to so many other things. And how do you create a point of view on top of that? Like even with Etsy, it's like when you own no products, you own no stock, how do you create a brand point of view on top of so many things that you don't own? Yeah, those are the ones that definitely stay top of mind for me.
Another aspect that we kind of see shift, like drifting into the brand space constantly, is the question of sustainability. And like companies are feeling the outside pressure to become more sustainable, who might not have had that at the core of their DNA to begin with. What we've seen is that it's often now put kind of on the person in charge of brand to make this happen and to make it and to communicate it. In some cases, that brand person is a little bit ahead of where the reality of the organization is. I think one of the complexities that I hear from people in roles like yours, but at smaller companies usually, is that like, well, I'm not an expert in sustainability, and yet I'm asked to have these incredibly complicated conversations. I saw in your description of your new role at Salon, though, that this will also be on your plate. Is that something that you feel like, oh yeah, this is a topic, you know, that I'm going to embrace, I'm going to run with it? Is it something that you're, you know, have doubts around? It's a complex topic, and
it's incredibly complex. And especially when you take into consideration wanting to do it authentically. And that a lot of it also comes down to like, it's not just a matter of brand communications, it's actually also like the core business itself and how it conducts itself. Like this is not something that you can sort of tack on at the end of a company and just say like, this person, you're responsible for this. The benefit of working at Zalando is that there is a sustainability team, which is great to have as an internal resource to actually be able to talk to, because a lot of it is also being able to influence things like, you know, operations, production, the choices that you're making about the things that you sell, but also like in the terms of e-commerce, you know, a lot of it has to do with like very thoughtful decisions about like, how are you approaching your own impact in terms of like, e-commerce is not great for the earth. Like shipping stuff is not great for the earth. fashion inherently in this idea of newness is not necessarily great for the earth. So being like, how can we try to limit this impact in a way that feels like, I don't know, moving in a direction to try to be more net positive, but at the same time, like, how do you talk about this in a way that doesn't feel like greenwashing, which I think is a really unique challenge. So the way that we're approaching it at Zalando is actually, I actually worked on the sustainability communication strategy pretty recently. So I am familiar with that piece, but a lot of it is around, for us, actually, like, it comes down to partnerships as well. And actually thinking about, like, if you're not in a position to be a subject matter expert, how can we actually bring in people who are closer to this, who are subject matter experts, who can actually, like, come from a place of, as a brand, transparency, being humble, admitting where you have room to grow, being, like, very transparent about, like, where the brand stands today in terms of all the different commitments that it's made, but also, like, when you fail, when you're actually not doing well. Because I think the worst thing that you can do is actually to try to just greenwash and say that everything is, you know, we took away the printers and suddenly we're great now. But I would say that, yeah, for anyone who's in this type of position, I think looking to any resources that you can gather in terms of people who are experts in the space to be able to, yeah, humble yourself. And I think also just, like, learn, but also try to integrate it as a core value within the company overall, because if it just falls into this idea of, like, comm strategy, it's never going to succeed or be truly embraced throughout an entire company.
Yeah, I imagine that. I mean, in a way, it feels like that's the same conversation as what we're talking about when we say, like, okay, well, brand needs to influence customer experience. Well, if we're saying that sustainability is at the core of the brand, that it needs to influence the supply chain.
Yes.
In the same way, like, brand needs to influence HR. So if it touches on all of those things, and I guess one of the qualities that you need to have as a brand director is that you need to be able to make friends with all of those departments, kind of orchestrating the teams that need to be able to put that in place. And so I imagine it takes a very particular type of skill, and talent to take that role as a brand exec these days.
I think so. I think a lot of it also comes down to influence, like when you don't actually have the ability to fundamentally make someone do something, or it comes down to influence and being able, I think, also to get people bought into your vision and being able to, at the end of the day, really, like, tell a good story and help them feel like they are excited about this idea as well, and they can see it as something that's net positive for everyone. Because I think, yeah, you can't force people to think a certain way.
Yeah, if only we could. It'd be the department of propaganda in a totalitarian state. Is there anyone in the audience who wants to take the opportunity? We have 6 minutes left with Alison, and she has a busy week, so I want to make sure that we respect her time. But if you do have questions, I'm very happy for anyone to share it in the chat, and I will mention it for you, or turn on your microphone, and I'm happy to listen in. Otherwise, I do have a few ones left on the list. So if we don't have ones coming in, I'm happy to keep to fill up the last 5 minutes. Let me also take the bigger view so I can see if anyone's raising a digital hand. One of the questions that was left on our list of questions, pre-submitted, for anyone who wants to move from a freelance position or an agency side into an in-house team, like, what are some tips? Like, how do you get that done, or how would you go about that? You've made the switch from in-house to outside to back in, so I would imagine you.
Yeah, I mean, I think making that transition is, I think, depending on the size of the company that you are interested in joining. I think that, so also I speak as someone who has not spent a ton of time on the agency side. Like, I've spent some time, but not a large portion of my career. I feel like you can really be, really go deep and be a subject matter expert in, like, brand strategy, as an example, on the agency side. Whereas I feel when you come in-house at a company like this, your stakeholders are so wide. And I think you need to also be looking for, emphasizing your level of, I think, that sort of, like, being that sort of cross-functional red thread that can pull together so many different parts of the organization, because that is the in-house role, is also just like really not just building a team or like working with an agency, gathering these stakeholders and getting that sort of buy-in. So it's like your clients are all around you all the time, and really trying to bring them along on this journey with you. I think there is also having that agency spirit experience is so valuable when you come inside, because I think you also just have much broader experience with so many other different types of brands in various categories, that I feel like can be really, really amazing to not just be someone who's always worked in one particular category or vertical their whole career. Like if you've had the benefit of being across a few different things over the course of your career, it could be great to come in and really have this sort of like outsider perspective, and also to sort of poke holes in any like pre-existing mindsets that people may have about like what brand means, how to do brand, how to, build a brand. I think that's something that I would consider.
Yeah, one of the things I've noticed in your career and the kind of brands that you work for is you go from Etsy to something like Blue Apron, which is of course also still kind of in the digital sphere, but it's such a different type of product, and I'm sure like a very different audience. When you first make the switch, is that a huge jump into like a deep sea where you feel like you really have to kind of get your bearings, or is that something that you used to kind of quickly making your own?
I really loved, so I spent 9 months at Blue Apron in a consulting role. We were working actually on an evolution of the brand strategy at the time, because Blue Apron had started as this sort of like leader in the space and sort of the first in the category. And then so many others had come along in terms of these like meal kits, and really sort of lost its way. It was a really interesting challenge. I will say that from like a brand point of view, and when you think about all the touch points that you can influence, like I mentioned with these platforms like Etsy, like you don't influence the packaging, like how people ship stuff, like when they receive it and open it, like so many elements are out of your control. Whereas when you have something like a Blue Apron, to actually be able to like, when you're thinking about all the brand touch points, like the physical box experience, when you open it, like how it smells, like so many different things that you can control. It was really actually such an amazing experience, especially doing this like rebrand, to think about all these different ways that you could bring it to life, but also that you had like more control over. So that to me was like super different industry. Also just like talk about supply chain, like very different when you're in like food versus something else in e-commerce. And but I feel like that's all the better for being able to be much more like multidimensional in your experience.
Cool. Well, I imagine that some of the people that are listening today are going to kind of think about all the ways that they could bring a brand career to life through different sectors and through different roles inside and out. Thank you so much, Alison, for sharing all of your experience and knowledge. It was really, really a delight to hear kind of your perspective, which is quite unique for someone to be willing to open up so much about their professional life as you did for us today. Thanks for joining us. Everyone join me in the round of thanks for Alison. And good luck in your new role. We'll be following you. And
this has been really fun. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Hope that we can check in with you in a while and see how you're doing.
All right. Thank you again. This has been, I don't think I've talked about myself this much in a very long time. Thank you for the opportunity.
You're most welcome. Thanks so much. For everyone else who's on the call today, if you thought this was an inspiring conversation, we have a conversation next month with George Beverly on audience research. So one of the things that we often notice in our programs is that it's actually really hard sometimes to know who's your ideal client and how do you get to know more about them. The only way, of course, is to do research, is to talk to people. And George calls himself the audience detective, and he has lots of really cool practical tips on how you can do audience research without hiring like a huge research company. So join us for that and hope to see you guys soon. Have a good day. Thanks, Alison.
Thank
Bye.
You. Bye.